Welcome to the Afropolitan Podcast, hosted by Eche Emole, founder of Afropolitan. On the show, we chat with Afropolitans whose footprints form the foundation of systems dedicated to building the future of a bold and progressive Black community. In each episode, our guests share their working formulas, the hard facts about leaving familiar terrain, embracing the unknown, and staying relevant afterwards. Listen as we extract the blueprints of fearlessness, innovation, and progress.
In today's episode, we chat with Adeniyi Abiodun, co-founder and chief product officer of Mysten Labs. Mysten Labs is creating infrastructure and tools for the decentralized future. Adeniyi talks about the newly launched SUI blockchain network and his experience fundraising for Mysten Labs. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Adeniyi, welcome to the Afropolitan Podcast. We're excited to have you on the show today. How are you doing? How are you feeling?
Doing great. Thank you very much. Really excited to be part of this.
Let's dive right in. Can you walk us through your journey to becoming the CPO of Mysten Labs?
Sure thing. I mean, I'll probably start right back at the beginning. My family, my brother and my dad are economists. I chose the technology path. But either way, I mean, I went to university to study electronic engineering. And during that time, I realized that programming and writing applications was something I cared more about than anything else. So I transitioned more into the computer science field. And my first job actually got, I remember at the time when I was applying for jobs, nothing was coming out after I graduated from university. Nobody was responding to me. I was getting no response or I was just getting rejections. But then there's this company in Chelsea in England that I really had interest in called Zencus, and they were building wireless monitoring systems. I basically spoke to the CEO and offered my services for free to try it out for 3 months, and he actually paid me for the job, and I got a job there. That's my entry into work. And from then on, I built my career, went over to the finance space, started building software for hedge funds and trading houses to optimize their portfolios and doing risk management. And I found myself at JP Morgan and HSBC banks, basically building portfolio margin software. But in 2012, and actually 2011 is when I found out about Bitcoin. I read the white paper, I found it terribly intriguing, and I thought the technology could ultimately change the world. It was very early days, and Bitcoin was almost nothing back then, right? It cost almost nothing to buy. But I dipped my hand in by just simply running my own mining. And over time, I found other people had the same problem, and I realized that was a common problem in the space, and I built a business around that called cloud hashing. It ended up mining, I think, a massive amount of Bitcoin. I think the value today would be in the $500 million to $1 billion range.
Wow.
If you had to assess the value, I mean, Bitcoin's low now, but it was a significant amount of Bitcoin we mined as a business, and that got acquired by a company here in the Bay Area. And through that process, I built a cloud big data company. Then after that, I went over to Oracle to launch Oracle Cloud Blockchain. Then I went over to VMware for a very short stint to do the same thing. But I built my career in the blockchain space ultimately from, being an OG in the crypto space and then now doing things myself, rather helping enterprises launch their own products and services. And I found myself at Facebook working on the Libra project for the last 2.5 years of my career. And that was a lot of fun. I had a ridiculous amount of fun there, and that's where I met my co-founders, and that's where Mysten got formed. We were working for Libra for the last 2.5 years. That ultimately didn't launch, but we were able to really learn a lot about what was required in the crypto space, and we're building our business off that knowledge. And I think it's a really good time to be building, even if the market's down. I think it's the best time you form the best businesses.
Definitely. So talk us through the Mysten Labs vision.
So Mysten Labs believes fundamentally that the biggest barrier to entry to scale the next phase of a world of digital rights management or ownership is infrastructure. There's this world where everyone owns their own stuff and things get digitized and tokenized, but there is an infrastructure to represent everybody's ownership. And people have done that with all forms of different schemes, whether it's layer ones, layer twos, layer threes that you hear of now. But nobody's built infrastructure that can operate at a Facebook scale, namely handle billions of users at the same time concurrently. Mysten Labs' real vision is to really accelerate adoption of Web3 by building infrastructure to actually remove those barriers. right? So we are basically building infrastructure. We're focused on the real low layer, right? That would enable Web3 adoption across the space. And that would enable a world of builders to build new types of applications that have ownership as a centerpiece to how the applications actually operate.
I love it. I love it. Mysten Labs launched a blockchain platform called Sui, right? Can you give us a broader view as to the role Sui helps to play in the ecosystem?
Absolutely. I mean, Sui is our first product that we're launching at the company. Sui is a layer one, but we think it's a layer one like no other. Most blockchains have this notion of a limited amount of throughput, right? Like you run your blockchain, and if the number of applications get busy, then all of a sudden the fees go through the roof. You've seen that with Solana, Ethereum, Avalanche. You've seen that with all sorts of different networks, right? And they all employ these interesting ways to scale that actually starts to break once you look into the details. They promise scalability that hasn't really been realized. And that's fundamentally because they've been designed with the same kind of design principles, right? So when we built Sui, we took a first principles approach. Said, look, if we needed to support billions of people concurrently transacting, and we wanted the Facebooks of the world to operate on a public blockchain ledger, it needs to operate like AWS and GCP, right? Like I run my microservice on AWS and GCP, and I don't worry that other people are running apps and it gets busy and fees go through the roof. My fees don't change because 5 other people had this DAO or a land sale that happened on Ethereum, right?
Yeah.
Like, that idea is ridiculous. Like you cannot build consumer products with this variability in fees. You can build casinos for sure, like things that people can trade and like people can speculate, right? But you cannot build like wide ranging consumer applications. So Sui takes that into account when we designed it. Sui is the only blockchain that can actually horizontally scale. Namely, you can build an application in Sui and have high performance. And the operators of the network, namely the validators, can add more capacity to the network that actually increases the throughput. So, if you're doing normal payments in your game that you're using Sui for, and then someone else launches an NFT sale, that shouldn't really affect your fees, right? Because the network can scale to handle the increased capacity. That's a fundamentally different approach than anyone else has taken, right? Like the idea that, a blockchain should be unbounded in terms of performance is something we think is going to be critical to actually enabling the next set of builders. And if you remember, the Facebooks, the Googles of the world came out of the last recession, of the last massive bust of the .com. And we think, we're having another interesting time for the crypto right now, right? Where we see asset values ridiculously low. We're in a recession. We think there's going to be opportunities to really build the next wave of businesses that really have a sense of ownership as a core piece of what they're building to offer consumers. And we believe Sui is going to be that layer one to actually enable that.
I love that. So while we were at the Crypto Bahamas conference with FTX, we were introduced to this concept called unbroken composability. I don't know if you've heard of that before.
I mean, the thing about crypto space, people probably invent a lot of new words. Yeah. So I need to know what that means exactly, yeah.
So I think, to paraphrase, what they were trying to explain was the difference between like an Ethereum and a Solana, right? Which is going back to first principles. Why do you have to have the whole gas fees, like where you're spending hundreds of millions on gas fees just to make a purchase, right? Like that's not something we experience today, even in Web2 with Stripe or Visa or MasterCard, right? So I think that whole idea is, I wonder if Sui falls within the unbroken composability aspect, since it says you can expand it horizontally as well. So you no longer have to, I guess the simple way to ask this question is, Solana has a specific TPS, right? What would you say compared to Sui, the TPS volume is? And TPS means transaction per seconds, right? Yeah,
oh, sure. So Solana has been around for a while. And, when Solana measures transactions per second, right, I mean, you have to look into the details, right? I think they've quoted they can do 60,000 transactions per second. I can't remember what number they quote. But if you look at the realities of what is actually running on chain, I think you see them running in, 1,000 to 2,000 TPS. We think that's really kind of what you expect Solana to run at. So they don't really scale. So Solana only scales within the confines of a machine. So, a machine could only get so big, right? Before, you can't scale it anymore, right? So everything scales vertically. It doesn't scale horizontally. No blockchain scales horizontally. Namely, I can throw more resources to it to make it more powerful, right? Every blockchain, you stuck with one machine. I mean, that one machine is what you get. In fact, the other problem is as you add more validators to any of these networks, right, the performance drops significantly, right? Yeah. So we've taken those challenges as a kind of focus of how we solve the scalability problem with Sui. So where Solana does 1,000, 2,000, Avalanche maybe does is kind of the same. They're all really the same. And by the time there's a benchmark done recently of all these networks, if you do like a Uniswap trade, they're all really in the hundreds of transactions per second. None of them is really doing high skill work with a high number of concurrent users. Sui is already today end-to-end doing 120,000 transactions per second on a MacBook Pro. That's not running on some AWS server that you're paying, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to operate, right? To even try and get 200 TPS that you get with other networks. A single MacBook Pro in this ecosystem, if 20 or 30 validators are running MacBook Pros, we can get 120,000 TPS. So it's orders of magnitude improvement. So we're talking about the internet today going from dial-up to broadband, and that's what Sui is doing. We always say we're bringing BTC, broadband to crypto, right? Like it's literally going from dial-up, which the majority of all layer ones are today, and even layer twos have the same problem. It's also not scalable, right? But Sui as a layer one is bringing that broadband perspective where we can do 120,000 TPS on very basic info setup. And as you add more, you add another MacBook Pro and it increases. You add another and it increases. So you can scale the network horizontally. Yeah, that's what you expect from a cloud service provider. But we're doing that with a decentralized proof of stake network.
There are competing worldviews, especially in the Web3 blockchain space. There are people who are maybe Bitcoin maxis or Ethereum maxis or even decentralization versus decentralization. Where would you say you fall within that spectrum? And what is the worldview or point of view that Mysten Labs has towards these differing perspectives?
It has to do with network effects, right? Like, you're valuing these networks as the size of the network effect, or at least the potential future size of a network effect. And those have tremendous value, right? But the value starts to become realized once, you have a challenge to it, right? Like everyone's becoming more value investors now. Like you think, okay, well, I'm not going to buy this X coin because, there's no real utility out there, right? So I think we're seeing those pressures. For me, Bitcoin is really a digital form of money. I don't see it as anything more than that. It's really a representation of non-centralized governance of money that value is based on what people believe the value is going to be. Like if I have faith in Bitcoin and I'm going to hold Bitcoin, I'm a big fan of Bitcoin. I still am, and that's never going to change. The other networks, right? I think even Ethereum, you can argue, has almost become like a form of money to a large extent, although it does have a protocol to enable fully Turing complete execution of applications. It does seem to behave a bit more like money, right? The rest of the space is really trying to be core infrastructure that people can build the next set of apps. Right? ETH 2.0 is trying to be that. Solana wants to be that. Avalanche wants to be that. So to your question on like decentralization, like we believe decentralization actually is a way to limit risk, right? Like, not having a central point of failure, having diverse minds in terms of operation of a network and changing rules and governance for the wider element of the ecosystem. I think the difference between like centralized entities and the decentralized entities is like decentralized entities are run by a quorum of ecosystem maximalists, should I say, right? Who really believe in the infrastructure, who really believe in the technology and are willing to push that network forward. So the way you run a centralized cloud service is very different from how you do that with a decentralized company. We're full-on pushers of decentralized technology. It's the only way to do the kind of things you want to do here at the scale and then enable others to participate in a way that we can all drive like real common standards of how software should be executed and interacted with.
I love that. Mysten Labs has raised $36 million in the last funding round, right? Led by A16Z. What would you say was your experience with the fundraising process and what lessons did you learn from it as well?
Yeah, I mean, the fundraising process it actually ended up being quite interesting for us. I mean, we had all in all 45 participants who were interested in investing in a round. I believe 43 were all yeses and 2 passed. So there was significant interest in our round. We had quite a lot of term sheets. We ultimately landed with Andreessen Horowitz and Redpoint and a few other venture firms. And it was a great experience for us. I mean, look, ultimately we benefited from our background at Facebook, right? Being able to demonstrate that we can run full-scale large systems. And we built a stellar team of Class A candidates, right? Who are leaders in their own rights in every single field, right? We have Kostas, who's a lead in cryptography. The guy is a brain box. We have Evan, who is an ACM computer science winner, who's our CEO. We have Sam. I mean, Sam is an inventor of the Move programming language, probably the youngest principal engineer at Facebook. We have George. You can run 20 businesses over George's ideas, right? So it's an A-list. It's an A-list of founders, right? Which really sells, right? And I think that's been our mantra. Like we want to hire the best talent, build the best team, and then we'll solve the most challenging problems, right? And there's nothing that makes hiring easier than working on really hard problems than the mundane, I want to optimize, a web page, or I want to optimize some analytics, right? Like, that's interesting, right? But like, if you want to solve some real fundamental computer science problems, we think Mysten offers that. And that's been very helpful in getting candidates, but also I think it's been compelling in terms of the problem space we're in for a lot of investors.
I love that. And so then let's talk through the importance of recruiting and retaining talent as well. What have been some of the challenges that maybe you have faced as an entrepreneur, and what advice would you give to founders who are looking to not just recruit talent, but also be able to retain them as well?
Yeah, I mean, the hiring process is you selling, not just you trying to vet people, right? So you have to treat it as that. So your public image outside of just, your recruiting pool that you build is super critical. What you say, what your founders say publicly about your products, where you're seen and what space you're tackling, all those add. Because believe you me, people do research on your company before they apply, yes. Right? Some people might not, right? There's a fringe people who don't do any kind of research, but good candidates will research your company and find out about you and tell you things that, that they're hearing about the space. And I think even that interview process is a good place to learn about what your public image is. So that helps to building a really strong pool, right? Having a good PR, namely, posting on Twitter, posting on, all sorts of social media, interesting things that you're working on, sharing more openly what you do rather than keeping it all in-house. That helps to attract talent, right? Because it's something they can assess and benchmark against others. Separately, solve interesting problems and have a real reason for why you're solving them and why it's a real big opportunity. Just like you pitch to a VC, you also need to pitch to candidates, right? And tell them why they should join you and not 5 other startups, especially in the crypto space that we're in, where it's super competitive for talent. There's just not a lot of experts in the space. So we have to make the case why a bet on Mysten for the next 2 to 3 years of a career, or maybe 5, right, is a better bet than 5 or 6 other companies out there. And that's something you're always competing for. And you find at times you might not need to pay the same, right, than someone who might not say overpay, but will be willing to go above and beyond what you're offering to get the best talent, because people ultimately care about the problem space and they're able to make that assessment themselves.
I know Mysten's go-to-market has focused on the gaming sector. Can you talk to us why the gaming sector versus other sectors in the industry?
Sure. So SWE is a layer 1 that is general purpose. Anything can run on it. We've specifically chosen to index on going for the gaming industry because if you imagine, we're saying our blockchain has this crazy performance that's hard to believe. And the best way to kill doubt and the best way to grow market share is really show people. And for us, the interesting workloads in the gaming space, because one, their scale is just completely bigger than every other space, right? Like if you think about games that have hundreds of millions of users, right, who are actively playing, buying things, trading things amongst themselves, killing bots, right, you name it. They have higher requirements from blockchains than traditional apps that are running on blockchain today. So there's no better way for us to highlight that by going to the gaming industry where there is that demand for high throughput, low cost, high amount of storage, and we can showcase that. And that's a beachhead for other people to see that, look, the most demanding workloads are running on this SWE network. Why don't we go to SWE? Because one, the gamers are there, because there are more users in games than other crypto verticals as far as I'm concerned, right? The users are there, the markets are there, the trading's happening there. Let's bring our content over to the SWE network, right? So that for us is why we've chosen that as a target. And the hires we're making in that space kind of represent that as well. But that doesn't mean that we don't care about DeFi, we don't care about finance or commerce. We absolutely have 3 pillars we care about. It's gaming, finance, and then finally digital commerce. So we're indexing high on gaming because that's an area where we think we can really show prowess, where we're not just 10x better, but probably 100x or even more better than everyone else there.
I love it. So there's been a lot of volatility in the market, as you can imagine, over the last 2 or 3 weeks. What are some of the areas that make you bullish about the space? And what advice would you give to newcomers into the space as to how to really think through the promise that blockchain technology has?
Yeah, I think, look, when the macro is so noisy, everything gets hammered, right? It's hard to focus on value, right? When, there's so much uncertainty around inflation, uncertainty around, just overall growth and wars and everything else that's happening, right? So that kicks everything down. So it's hard to kind of draw right values and comparisons between various projects. But I think the key thing is you look for projects that are focused on solving an actual real problem. But there's a lot of projects in crypto that I personally just detest because they're not really bringing incremental value, right? If you look at what's been happening from the ICO phase all the way to today, how much incremental value has actually been built in the space, from a user perspective, like who's really benefiting, right? Apart from the same rich people trading amongst themselves, right? Like, I mean, who are we brought in 20 million, 100 million people into the space to actually grow that?
Yeah.
I think that's something I like to, we want to solve, right? Like if we can bring the right set of infrastructure, then the lower value use case, for example, like if you have $60 gas fees, nobody's going to be thinking about doing reward systems, right, on blockchain. No one's going to be thinking about doing concert tickets on blockchain, right, because the gas fees don't make sense. But if you have 1 penny fees, or if you have a tenth of a penny fees, and these are real fees that are sustainable, like standard fees, then a broad ecosystem can come and use this network, right? So I think trying to solve scalable problems and not just trying to focus on a very small segment of the same people is how we're going about it.
I love that. So everyone gets to deal with failure at some point, right? What would you say was your most significant encounter with failure as an entrepreneur? How did you deal with it, and what did the experience teach you?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. I think there's no way I'd have made it to where I am without like encountering failures on many levels, right? One of the failing areas I've had in the past, right, is sometimes you got to be careful who you work with, right? You've got to be able to have trust with the people you work with, irrespective, right? No matter how good the project is. But if there's a lack of trust, you've got to question yourself, like, is this a business you want to be in? Are these the right people you should be engaging with, right? So I've had a past of working with people where I overly indexed on their capabilities and they end up not proving to be correct, right? Separately from that, also not being able to rightly assess the challenge ahead, right? Like before you build a house, go and count the cost, right? As it said, right? But being able to really assess the overall scope of what you're trying to encounter to build. And I do believe like you try and iterate quickly and move first, but really try and do a really good costing of what you're trying to build, what's required. And you do that by talking to way more people than just your friends, right? Try and speak to experts in the space, get a broader perspective, a very diverse perspective on the space before you really go gung-ho into a particular thing, right? So that's what I've learned. Also, I've learned like, operating at scale matters. Doing something that has a very small amount of users and then jumping to a Facebook scale, which has billions of users, right? That gets you to really index high. So I would say this is probably a plug for like the Facebook and Googles of the world, right? Try and get into some of these companies that are operating at scale, right? Because there's something they're doing that you're not learning in a very small company, or you're not learning at a particular company you are right now. There's something to be said about operating at a scale, irregardless of politics and like how you feel, right? Like there's certainly something to be said of people operating at a scale. There's some skill that they've learned. There's some element of execution that they do better than everyone else. And I think I really was able to sharpen my skills very, very well over the years working at various large institutions. I thought I was doing well in banking, but then, you go into the other side of the space, right? And the scale is completely different.
Yeah. And it's funny because you're multidisciplinary in a sense, because you're going from like the finance side of things to the tech Silicon Valley side of things as well. So I'm sure you have perspectives that have informed even the role at Mysten as well. Yeah,
I mean, I've been very lucky in my career, right? I feel really blessed, right? I've been an engineer, I've been an engineering manager, I've been a CEO, I've been a product manager, and product is something that naturally, particularly, I've like diverted to over time, and I really enjoy it. So I think being able to have done all those things, having this broad set of experience, has actually enabled me to transition well into what I do now. That's not like try to broaden your skills, right? Like it's, doing one thing. Like no one says you need to be an engineer for life, right? Nobody said you need to be a PM for life. Nobody said you need to be one particular role for life. Like you find that you can actually be a lot more capable than you are, right? But I'm not the best coder anymore for sure. So I leave that to the experts, and I apply my skill on what I feel I do well now.
Are there any 3 books in your life that have had a profound impact?
Well, beyond the Bible, right? Like I'm a Christian. That's a book that's changed my life profusely. And I think the other books I really, really like is there's a book that my wife shared with me. I've got to get the name. I'll probably share it with you after. It's on being like really good leaders in the product space. I'm one of those guys who I really hate reading books. Like unless it's on a Kindle, I'm not reading it, right? But this book is really, really good to get me to understand like others who have executed in the space, what their learnings were, how they dealt with challenges, how they pushed back, and how they grew their businesses. That's been really helpful for me, right? I'll share that book with you. It's actually a book for PMs or aspiring PMs who want to grow in the space. So those are really 2 books that come off my mind. And beyond that, like I read more than anything every day. Like I'm always reading online. My ingestion of information is at a pace where it's probably the highest it's ever been, right? Especially in this space in crypto where things change by the minute. Like writing a book in crypto probably doesn't make sense because by the time you've written it, even if it's in a month, it's already out of date, right? So, there's certain people are following on social media all the time because they're always a wealth of information. That's where I get a lot of my info today. And of course, like CoinDesk, right, is one of the things, right? But like the block and things like that, these are things I read on a constant basis, but really following really key people in the space who are sharing what's happening in their ecosystem, because that's way more valuable than what someone's written 5 years ago. That's where I get the most of my learnings now. Are there any podcasts that you're a fan of then? Yeah, there's one I listen to a lot called Security Now that's been around for a very long time. And it's more about the security space, but I find that the host of that show absolutely amazing. I listen to that show all the time. Podcast-wise, that's probably the only podcast I listen to more than anything. I go in and out of podcasts. I get interested in a podcast and I get disinterested in the podcast, right? Like normally with podcasts, someone shares something with me that's interesting and I'll follow it and then the topics become deviated for what my core area of interest in. Yeah, then I jump onto the next thing, right? Like I'm not static in that area that I can bookmark one person. No, I understand. So, Nee, if the only thing left in the world was to read a book about your life, what would the title of the book be? That's a good question. I wish I had time to prepare for that. I would say risk, right? How to manage risk, right? I would say me and my wife are different, right? Like she's the one who will probably hold the purse on the side and I'm the one I'm like, okay, there is a 1% chance of making this. Throw everything at it. Roll the dice. Roll the dice, I have the same way. So I think I'm blessed I've got a great wife who's able to counterbalance that, right? That, grounded. Keep me grounded because I'm an all-in type of person. Like once I get involved in something, it's 100% or zero. Like I'm not interested in zero. So I think that would be it, how to manage risk. And I think it's a story not just of myself, but I think it's a story of my marriage, my wife and my family and like having other diverse thought processes that can help you make decisions and not counting on your own understanding alone. I think that's the key, right? Like I think I really respect people that are able to take inputs from others, like who can take advice. And that's something early in my career that I was not very good at, right? I was very gung-ho, I know what I'm doing, I'm going to run 100 miles an hour, and I'm going to do it and get it done, right? Like make mistakes along the way and learn, right? Fine, right? But then the challenges and mountains are too high to climb by yourself. And that's one thing I've learned. And being able, through the time, finding the right mentors, finding the right people that I can listen to, that I have great respect for, and I'm able to make decisions not just based on my own ideas anymore, but I'm able to bring in broader perspectives. That is an area that I use to manage risk. Right, and I count on that more than anything. Whether it comes from investment, building businesses, relationships, you name it. That's an area I think, right, like being able to have like a very core set of people that you can lean on for advice, and then using that as a risk management process, right? I think beyond risk, it works for all aspects of life, right? But I think in terms of like challenges, like for example, when I was going to leave Facebook, like everyone thought I was absolutely crazy. You're going to leave a really cushy job or whatever, you're going to build another business. For me, I'd been there before. I'd already left companies before. I knew what it was like. But now, married with children, very different story, right? From the first time I did this, right? Where things were progressing very slowly. But being able to talk to the right people who tell you, how do you manage your money better? How do you have plans? How do you have a future? How do you plan beyond the now, right? Like these are the things that help you to. Yes, absolutely. Definitely. So a lot of founders struggle with the fundraising process. I want to couch this with a quote from Naval where he says, startups are the Olympics of business, right? And I think it was on Clubhouse. He told a lady like, hey, don't get into the ring unless you feel like you actually have the best team to execute on this, right? You're going for gold. Silver is like distant last, right? So if you're going to do a startup, really think through the team you want to take to attack this. What advice would you give to founders who are getting the fundraising process and might not be getting the right signals from investors, and maybe they've not really taken the time to do that self-assessment where you're like, hey, do I actually have the right team that I'm bringing to go execute on this? Like you said earlier, the team at Mysten are like the top of the top, right? Like it's easy to look through their background, what they've done. This makes sense. Okay, we're going to take a bet on this team to execute on this. So do you have any advice for founders? Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately investors, now this matters a lot more than anything else, right? Yeah. Because I would argue most VCs are turning to value investors, not venture capitalists, right? Given where the market's at, right? So they're going to hone in on the patterns they know best. And that's typically excellent teams with excellent products. It's not excellent products with excellent teams. It's excellent teams, because the teams come first, with excellent products, right? That really matters, because ultimately the product can change over time, because things pivot all the time. But if you have a great team together, like that really work together as a cohesive group, you can get through any kind of downturn. You can get to any kind of problem and challenges. You can find out how to change things to tend to the right market, change your market segment completely and focus on another area. So that's something you have to be aware of, right? Like really think, these are kind of people that I can go to war with, right? These are kind of people that are, skills beyond just this one thing that they do very, very well, right? But if we ever need to change, is that going to be a problem, right? Are they married to this one idea beyond what they brought to the table, right? So as a startup founder or co-founder, you really need to be assessing your team from that perspective, right? Will you go to war with this team? These are kind of people you trust, right? And, can you stand in front of VCs and say, honestly, that this is the best team? I mean, not just lying to your friends or like talking to family or whatever, or to try and sell the idea to your wife, right, as to why you're leaving. They're a great team, don't worry, right? But like, can you stand on a heart in front of VCs and really attest that this is the best team to execute here? Because they can tell if you're honest about it. They can tell if it's real, because ultimately when the questions start coming and then you have the pushback, you have the right set of responses. So that's going to shine through. So that's a bit of feedback I'd certainly like to give.
Definitely. Nee, we ask all our guests this question, right? What does being Afropolitan mean to you?
I mean, that's my DNA, right? Like, as a background, like I grew up I was born in Nigeria. I didn't say grew up in Nigeria. I was born in Nigeria. I left when I was 7 or 8 years old, right? And I, lived in Scotland for like 6 years before moving to London. People have said my accent has changed a little bit since moving to America, but I disagree with that statement. but no, like I remain very connected with my community. We built a very tight community of actual Nigerians in this Bay Area. I think we have one Ghanaian in the group too. We let him creep in a little bit. But no, we do a lot of things with the Afro community and the Black community, and because ultimately, look, not all of us have the benefit of like having families of wealth, right? That pass things on to us, or, had growing businesses that we could just inherit walking out of bed, right? Well, a lot of us had to build things from scratch. So we know it wasn't given to us, but also the information, we weren't always in the best positions to learn the right information. It wasn't shared with us. It wasn't knowledge. So the ability to share knowledge and pass it on, and to invest in Black businesses and invest in businesses that really are catering to your community is something that we do. I'm part of a group called Club 14, and it's a team of Nigerians who invest in businesses in Nigeria. But more than anything, we do a lot of community programs as well. But we also help keep each other honest. Like, how are you progressing? What's your next thing in your career? We invest in each other's businesses. We tear each other's ideas apart, right? It's a really cutthroat group, right? If you have a business idea to push forward. But that's what we do, and I think for me it really matters. Even for my children, I think my son and daughter have Yoruba lessons every week. So things like getting them connected with their roots and being connected with people who look like them and who are like them also helps them answer a lot of questions they have for themselves too. So it means a lot to me.
I can definitely testify to the group. Definitely, providing real critical feedback that helped us even through our own fundraising process.
They're brutal.
They're very, very, very brutal. The way I took it was, it's better that you get this from your brothers than you go out there and it's worse. So it definitely was. It helped us really be able to articulate and understand what our advantages were and what we were trying to solve. So definitely grateful to Club 14 and also the Camo Group. Nee, man, thank you so much for coming by the Afropolitan Podcast. We would love to have you back here again. I hope you've had a great time so far.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back anytime. Thank you very much for your time too.
Thank you for listening to the Afropolitan Podcast. We are building the future of a progressive Black community. To join our community, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Afropolitan. Be sure to join our Discord and Clubhouse community by clicking on the link tree on our Instagram page. See you on social.